And the fact that we have so many booths here today is really a critical example of, if you're interested in wastewater treatment or solar, thermal, or photovoltaics, or buildings, or green walls, or any of the many technologies, to find out what's available and what can you do to actually put them into practice that are supported or encouraged at the household, community, state, federal level. That's really vital. That's why these sorts of events are so critical, so that we have that expertise. The last feature is that we really have to have this creative round of innovative financing, and I'll include my comments and look at that in more detail. I put up a few of the scenario slides, not to look at them in detail, but just to see that the scenarios at the top show from that greenish dashed line at the bottom to the red line at the top, and you can see that the scenarios we're following in terms of emissions are on the high end, and that the two bottom graphs, both the temperature line, that's the red line, and the sea level rise, are all running at the high end of our scenarios. Now that's exceedingly bad news because we have to make a dramatic change, and again, Governor Schwarzenegger signed not only the historic AB 32, but the historic Executive Order 305, which calls for the 80% cut in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I think that's the governor's 11th term. But that's the 2050 goal that we need to hit based on the science. And the fact that our scenarios are all running on the hot, for greenhouse warming end of the spectrum, not the cooler low end, means that we have some great paperwork, great fonts, great things written down, but we do not yet have execution. And so we all have to recognize that we are so far failing the test of action bending the curve. Now we have incredibly good starting materials, but we have to bend that curve. Outside California, I have spent a fair amount of time talking about the issues of climate change. At home, we don't have to, of course, because we're all sort of up to date with science. We all get our science updates on our iPods, so we know what's going on. But just so that you have kind of the latest, I think, encapsulated single graphic for how worried you should be. And this is the key conclusion of the climate conference, and that is that not only are the scenarios running on the high, dirty end, but the key signals on the planet are doing the same. So if I were to just zoom in for a second in terms of a kind of a preview for what we're seeing on the planet, and just focus in on the North Polar ice cap, this is the minimum amount of sea ice recorded each summer, the kind of the minimum number. You can see what's happened since 1980, when essentially everyone was alive. I don't see too many student types. But this dramatic downward trend is incredibly worrying news. The forecast for when we have an ice-free Arctic in summer was 2090 or so when I first began my doctoral studies, and it's now that we may have an ice-free summer in the next decade or so. That is an incredibly worrying event, and there's no graphic more telling, I think, than this one, showing not just the potential extreme events that may be tipping points, and that's why 2007 is highlighted in yellow there, but just that very steady and worrying downward trend. And bad news gets even worse. It's not just that the climate story is bad. As a physicist, I can give you a theorem, and the theorem is that bad can beget bad. It sounds more biblical, but let me explain. High energy prices that we were in, as we've heard before, and we expect we will move back into, without incredibly aggressive and thoughtful public policy and companies that make that policy real, will actually lead us to not a greener future because high prices mean the renewable energy world, energy efficiency somehow blossoms. It will mean more fossil fuels. I'm leaving this afternoon to head to Alberta to talk to the Alberta government, which does not exactly play fair on this. And if I could just illustrate with a graphic made by a friend of mine, Dan Miller, the small barrel at the far left, that 8/10 of a trillion barrels of oil, that's all the oil we've used in human history. And the peak oil story says we have about that much more out there. If I use more optimistic, if you're into fossil fuels, how to do technically. It's just expensive. We've used up not a half of the oil, but more like 1/45. That means that high oil prices without a strong policy will lead us to much dirtier oil. And the carbon footprint of a barrel of tar sands or coal-based oil is 2 to 3 times as bad as a regular barrel of oil. And you think it's not happening? Where I'm headed this afternoon, this is a picture in the Athabasca Basin of Alberta. Those huge piles of sulfur, that's just the waste material from making tar sands into oil. So translation, we're running out of atmosphere much, much faster than fossil fuels. And barring the kind of leadership California has shown, it's not going to matter that we have used up roughly half of the easy-to-get-to oil, or a third of it. We are on a path to cook ourselves long before we run out of oil. So we need solutions rapidly, and I'm going to try to highlight those in the remainder of my time. And just to show you how sort of perverse the economics is, high prices of oil in 2007 led Alberta to use natural gas, CH4, to separate out the hydrogen from that CH4, to use the hydrogen to extract that sulfur, because the sulfur bonds to hydrogen, giving you H2S, this rotten egg smelling stuff. And then they vent the hydrogen in the air and sell us this dirty oil. So the irony is that they could have sold us the natural gas or the hydrogen, but because of market forces, they sell us the oil. Hence California's need for things like a low carbon fuel standard that says, we will use the life cycle footprint of this barrel of oil as its environmental signature. And because there's more tar sands oil in Alberta than there is fossil fuel regular oil in Saudi Arabia, this is not just a small issue. This is the major driver, unless places like California and like-minded cities, states, and nations band together. High prices, which will return to fossil fuels, will bring us a dirtier future, not an entryway to a clean future. That's all the negative story I can tell since I'm seen by my students as the chronic optimist. Here's the optimistic side of that story. When California passed AB 32, that was hailed as landmark but potentially unachievable, people said, well, what are we going to do? We're going to have this nice paperwork, but nothing will happen. AB 32 was signed in 2007. This plot shows installed megawatts of solar and wind power in California. That's solar photovoltaics and solar thermal in California. If you don't think policy and incentives matter, just take a look at the dramatic ramp-up we have seen in installed capacity in 2008. And what's even more interesting is that the forecast for 2009, signed contracts, is to go to more than 3,000 megawatts of solar, wind, and some small amounts of trial projects for ocean and other energy in 2009. As of today, the Public Utilities Commission has over 20,000 megawatts of contracts for clean power that have been submitted. Now, no one expects all 20,000 will get built in this economic times, but it really highlights to any gatherers out there that policy leadership backed up by the right kind of incentives and working with the private sector can absolutely matter in a way that a lot of people say will pass this legislation, but nothing will happen. California, which only 8 years ago was in an energy crisis of epic proportions, has done a remarkable thing. And I think with all of the negative news, it's really important to highlight just how much of a change this combination of policy leadership and commitment can really do. Now, if I look at the federal emissions trajectory, this is the path that we're on. We used to call the business or the Bush as usual, which we thankfully can discard to the waste heap of history. The path that we're on, however, isn't that great yet. The Kyoto Protocol, which we sadly didn't sign, would have meant that the United States would have had to pass its emissions trajectory through the yellow triangle